Hey everyone, my name is Nabil Sayed. I am a biomedical science major, and I want to present to you guys about an investigation on optimal foraging, more specifically looking at predator discrimination in songbird species. Oops. So, in the fall of 2020, I decided to do this project with Dr. Kolbeck, and animals themselves are expected to adjust their foraging behavior to minimize the risk to predators. However, the ability of animals to discriminate among potential predators is an active area of research. We experimentally exposed songbirds to auditory playback of three potential predators. We exposed them to a sharp-shinned hawk audio, a Cooper's hawk audio, and a red-tailed hawk audio sound. And then we also threw in a non-predator control, which was our static white noise. And these sounds were all played near a bird feeder. So we recorded videos of experience from which we collected visitation data for all species before, during, and after audio playback. And so after getting our visual recordings, we estimated the mean time and the mean number of visits for each period. As all the data, it did trend in the expected direction where we saw a decrease in visits and time. However, there was a large amount of variation between trials, and the only significant result we could find was for the red-tailed hawk. And what we can say about the red-tailed hawk stimulus is that the only significant result was that the songbird spent less time at the feeder when we played the red-tailed hawk stimulus. So that was what we found in the fall of 2020. I was kind of bummed out with that because I really wanted to find out more information about sharp-shinned hawk, Cooper's hawk, and the static noise. So in the spring of 2021, I decided to individually look at species from the visual recordings we had. I used the Merlin Bird ID app to identify songbirds at the bird feeders. So I was hoping that I could divide the data into their own groups. So one group would be the Carolina chickadees, the other group would be a northern cardinal species group, another group would be the eastern bluebird group. But the issue was that the only species with a large enough sample size was the Carolina chickadee. The other birds that I mentioned, they didn't have a large enough sample size, so I really couldn't focus on those species in particular. So I could only focus on the Carolina chickadees themselves. So after evaluating the chickadees group, we noticed that in the sharp-shinned hawk, that Carolina chickadees spent less time at the feeder in the presence of sharp-shinned hawk playback audio. With the Cooper's hawk, we noticed that the number of visits at the feeder after the audio playback of Cooper's hawk decreased, but it was not significant enough for us to report because the p-values did not fall in the range that we were looking for. And the same thing can be said for the red-tailed hawk as well, as that even though we saw the average number of visits at the feeder decrease, we could not statistically confirm that with our paired t-test and our chi-squared analysis. So that's what we found. We only found that the chickadee spent less time at the feeder only for the sharp-shinned hawk stimulus. So when we compare fall of 2020 and spring 2021, we can obviously denounce that birds avoid predators that represent a more serious threat. But what we can more specifically say is that Carolina chickadees avoid sharp-shinned hawks, whereas all birds combined avoided red-tailed hawks. And so what we can maybe deduce from that as well is that chickadees, they are a much more smaller bird. You can see that right here. And they would perceive a smaller predator or a smaller accipiter as a threat, whereas all birds, including a woodpecker, would perceive the red-tailed hawk as a larger threat. So we notice that the Carolina chickadees avoid the sharp-shinned hawk, but all the birds in totality avoid the red-tailed hawk. Now this shows that the chickadees are focusing on different predators than the overall population of songbirds at large. Observationally speaking, our predictions seemed to be true in the sense that songbirds, chickadees, and other birds did perceive the predatory threats and avoided going to the bird feeder during their specific audio playback. It also kind of seemed apparent that the period after predatory audio playback had an increase in time and visits. However, our statistical analysis using our chi-square and our paired t-test could not prove that 100%. So, as I mentioned before, red-tailed hawks are not really a common predator to these songbirds, but so it was kind of interesting to see that all the birds in the fall of 2020 research that they kind of perceive the red-tailed hawk as a threat, but when you dive deeper into it, the Carolina chickadees as a group perceive the sharp-shinned hawks as a greater threat than they did with the red-tailed hawk. So after that happened, after I concluded that research, I got a little interested. I wanted to see what would happen if I did the complete opposite. Rather than having predators, why not try and do it with something more positive? So chickadees themselves are known to be the sentinels of the forest. They're all over the place. They're very large in terms of population size. And so the question is, do songbirds respond differently to a predator stimulus compared to a chickadee mobbing call stimulus? And so the chickadee mobbing call stimulus was basically an audio of Carolina chickadees vocalizing over a nearby owl. And so they were vocalizing over that. And we wanted to know if birds would adjust their foraging in a similar way if we played that mobbing call sound. And from what we found with that is that they don't seem to adjust foraging behavior, but they do flock in after the auditorial sound to see what the chickadees were upset about. From the graph and the calculations we made, we found that the average visits to the feeder during mobbing audio playback increase. It could be concluded that songbirds were curious to see what the mobbing sound indicated and decided to go to the feeder after that audio playback. That was the only stimulus or the only stimulus that was legitimate in the fact that the average number of visits to the feeder after the audio was increased. So what can we say overall? Overall, when we look at it, we can see that in the fall 2020 semester, all songbirds found the red-tailed hawk to be a significant threat. But when we dive deeper and we look at Carolina chickadees as a group, they avoided the sharp-shinned hawks more. And then when we look at the mobbing call research that we found that that songbirds are generally more curious to novel sounds and will most likely come to the bird feeder after that sound has been played or after that perceived threat or perceived sound is gone. Even though songbirds paid attention to the red-tailed hawks in the fall 2020 semester, they also paid attention to what chickadees were doing. Because after the chickadee mobbing audio playback stopped, the amount of visits and time slightly increased because they wanted to see what the Carolina chickadees were communicating about. Other birds are interested into what chickadees are vocalizing about, but in general, they respond to different cues and stimulus than the Carolina chickadees. Carolina chickadees found sharp-shinned hawk as a reasonable threat, and they focused more on sharp-shinned hawks than the red-tailed hawks and the Cooper's hawk. But the one thing I was kind of bummed about was that there was no conclusion that I could make with a white static noise. All the statistical analysis that I did could not prove that the observations were correct in that sense. For the future of this project, more trials could be done to the already existing stimuli, or you can also throw in different acoustic predatorial sounds, such as maybe a brown bear or maybe even human sounds, to see how songbirds respond in terms of foraging. And I would also like to give a big thank you to Malia Dunbar and the rest of the lab staff for their assistance. And I would like to thank Dr. Kolbeck for the awesome guidance in this project and for being the advisor for this project as well. If anyone has questions, they can email me at this email here. Thank you guys for listening to this presentation.